The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program, and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Thank you for joining us here on FRC Media. I have a very special guest with me today. He is Pete Souza. He's a photojournalist, but he is best known for his two stints as White House photographer for both Presidents Reagan and President Obama. He'll be here at Bristol Community College on April 18th to speak as part of the Wolfson Speaker Series. Unfortunately, as we record this, the tickets are sold out, but we'll have an opportunity to speak with Pete nonetheless. Pete, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You know, you're a South Coast boy, born and raised here in South Coast, Massachusetts, in South Dartmouth. Tell us briefly about your time here, how you grew up, and, how often do you get back?
Yeah, well, I was born in New Bedford and grew up in South Dartmouth on Smith Neck Road. And then I think when I was 12 or 13, we moved to Middle Street near Padenham. And I stayed until I went to college at Boston University, and then returned to South Dartmouth for I guess about a year before I ventured elsewhere. And I would get back at least every year, and then in 2020 my mom died, so I don't get back as often now.
Yeah. But you'll be back here on April 18th, so there's an opportunity maybe to see some friends at that time. Let me ask you, what got you into photography? Was there one moment? Was it during college, before college? What got you into photography, and specifically photojournalism?
Yeah, I went to BU with the hopes of becoming a sports writer, and in my junior year, I took a photography class in the School of Communication, and the bug hit me. I think the first print I ever made in the darkroom, I was hooked. I knew that this was something I wanted to do. I mean, as I kind of look back on my life, though, I have to say that the still photograph first struck me when I was 8 years old. Was when John Kennedy died, and those subsequent few days, I scissor cut several pictures out of the Standard Times. From LBJ swearing in to aboard Air Force One to some of the photographs surrounding the funeral. I cut all those pictures out of the newspaper and curated my own little photo gallery on my bedroom closet door. I had taped these pictures up to my door. So clearly the still photograph spoke to me at a young age. I guess it never really occurred to me that it was something that I could do.
Yeah. Did the journalism side as well also interest you? You mentioned, the assassination of President Kennedy, historical events that'll lead up to obviously getting to your work with the White House, but that kind of whet your appetite for journalism?
I think my appetite was more for documentation. Mm-hmm. When I think back of my, childhood and, I had made the decision to become a sports writer because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I loved sports. I just wasn't very good at it, and I thought, well, maybe I could, write about sports. And I often wonder, had I gone to, the New England School of Photography or some other college, if I would have become a music photographer or a portrait photographer, depending on where I ended up. I just happened to be in the journalism school, and so the photography classes that I took at BU were geared towards photojournalism. And I ended up just loving it. So, but who knows what would have happened if I had taken a slightly different direction when I originally went to college.
Yeah, you started in local journalism. You spent some time at in Chicago and other local newspapers. What did that teach you? And let me just ask you, sort of as an extension of that, how important generally is, we're seeing a lot of erosion of local journalism with newspapers being bought up by larger companies and many of those companies divesting their interest in local journalism. Talk about the impact local journalism had for you and how it maybe spurred you moving forward.
Yeah, my first two jobs were actually for daily newspapers in Kansas. And in one, I was one of three staff photographers, and at the other one, I was the only staff photographer. And the two things. One, there was something that was very beneficial about going out every single day, doing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 assignments, and in each case, having to come away with a publishable photograph. That was a really good training ground for me in and just making sure that in each situation, I was adapting to what was in front of me and trying to make a good picture in every case. The other good thing about working for a small newspaper was everybody in the community knew you. So there were times when, some readers would get really PO'd at photographs that you would put in the newspaper because they weren't necessarily, how do I say, not always photographs that people would like. I mean, because you're covering news events and situations like that. So when things go wrong, you're out there photographing, and those pictures end up in the newspaper. So it was a real chance to connect with the community, sometimes not necessarily in a good way. But it was, I think beneficial to me as the years went by.
Yeah. All right, let's shift to your time as a White House photographer. I guess talk a little bit about how you got each of those jobs, beginning with the Reagan administration and then with President Obama.
Yeah, and I think in both cases there was a stroke of luck in the circumstances. So with Reagan, I had, back when I was in Kansas, I had interviewed with the director of photography at the Kansas City Star, a woman named Carol Greenewald. I didn't get the job, even though I was hoping to get the job. And unbeknownst to me, she kept track of my career. Well, she eventually became the White House photo editor during the Reagan administration. And in the middle of Reagan's first term, they had an opening on the staff. And she reached out to me. I hadn't really talked to her since she didn't give me the job in Kansas City. But she reached out to me from the White House and said, hey, we think you'd be good for this job. Would you come and interview? And that's how the first job came along. 20 years later, I guess a little less than 20 years later, I was working for the Chicago Tribune based in Washington, D.C., when a guy by the name of Barack Obama became the U.S. Senator from Illinois. This is in 2004. And I documented his first year in the Senate in 2005 for the Tribune. I got access that no other photographers got because I was the hometown newspaper, and got to know him professionally. He got to see how I worked, and so subsequently, 4 years later, when he was elected president of the United States, he asked me to become his chief White House photographer.
And then when that happens, there has to be a lot of trust, right, between the boss and yourself. And from what I understand, you're given clearance as any national security clearance, right, in terms of being able to be in the room at specific events. How did you treat that responsibility?
Well, very, very seriously and very delicately. Barack Obama understood the importance of having someone visually document his presidency for history. I had a top secret SCI clearance, but ultimately the access is dependent on the president of the United States. And I think he trusted me enough to allow me to be there for virtually everything that happened during his administration. Without that trust and without that access, I wouldn't have been able to make a lot of the pictures that I ended up making during his administration.
And I know that in terms of having that access, your job is never partisan, right? You're there as a documentarian in many ways, right? You're the eye within the room that was documenting the history of those two administrations, and that's something that may be different, or is it, in terms of photographing someone like the President of the United States?
Well, I mean, I think, my background's as a photojournalist. And when you're working as a photojournalist for a newspaper or magazine, you're nonpartisan in a way. I mean, you're not, you're trying to photograph accurately and honestly what's in front of you. Obviously, we all have our own backgrounds and we look at things, from a photographer's standpoint, you look at things a little differently depending on the experiences in life that you've had. And it was the same way when you're photographing, a president of the United States, is you're trying to document for history what's taking place in front of you. There's not like, you're not thinking about it from a Republican standpoint or a Democratic standpoint. You're thinking about it from a historical standpoint. And you used the word nonpartisan. I guess it's nonpartisan. I just think of it as as a historical perspective more than anything.
Yeah. And also, in that role, you also get to see the president of times when he's with family, with behind the scenes that a lot of people may not see. That's also very important to document as well, to document the president as president, but also president as, family man, human being. Were there any times when the president or the first lady would say, this is a private time, Pete, we don't need you in the room?
A lot of it was dependent upon my intuition. I maybe it was a year and a half in to the Obama administration that I asked to meet with Mrs. Obama, because I wanted to make sure that she felt that my documentation of the family, because look, those girls were very young coming in. They were 7 and 10 when he was elected. And they were not elected. They just happened to be the daughters of the President of the United States. And I didn't ever want to do anything to make them feel uncomfortable. And yet at the same time, I wanted to document his role as his father. And so, I mean, I met with Mrs. Obama and I just said, hey, I just want to check in with you about, family pictures, whether I'm doing too much, too little, or am I approaching it in just the right way? And she reassured me that she thought I should just continue the way I was doing it. And so a lot of it, as I said, was intuitive. By that, I mean, like, I've got this picture that's in my book of him on the swing set outside the Oval Office with his daughter, Malia. She had gotten home from school early one day, and he just walked outside and had a conversation with her about her day. I wanted to make sure to get that picture because I thought it was a poignant photograph. But once I got, what I thought was a really good picture, I kind of backed away because I figured they didn't need somebody else listening in to, what was a father-daughter conversation. And it wasn't that he ever said anything to me about it. It's just, common sense and intuitive to give the guy some space in situations like that.
Yeah, I want to spend some time talk about some specific photos. One, very historical in nature. You were in the Situation Room the day that the United States apprehended and ended up killing Osama bin Laden. The famous photo of the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary of Defense, Vice President, President Obama, in that room in that very, very tense moment. Again, that's part of the job. But were there any instances like that you kind of knew, hey, this is going to be a big deal, And, is there any extra focus on what you're doing, or is it just like autopilot at that point?
I think it's a little of both, actually. I mean, I had been in, by that time, this was May 1st, 2011. By that time, I had been in dozens, maybe even hundreds of meetings in the Situation Room,
Mm.
all of them, of big consequence, where he's making big decisions. And so that's the autopilot part of it. But, the other circumstance is, obviously this was going to be a historic day. Bin Laden, who masterminded 9/11, we had been trying to hunt him down for 10 years. And finally they thought they had him. But, they didn't know for sure. And I think one of the things that strikes me about that photograph is, you got the people you mentioned, all the most powerful people in the executive branch of our government, who are, the ones that make decisions. But in this particular case, there's nothing they could do to affect the outcome of what they were watching. And I think that led to this tension and anxiety that you see in everybody's faces. In terms of me personally, I think on a day like that, I think that my senses were on high alert in terms of making sure that I was looking for any little thing that may be, important someday historically. And so I was making sure that I was documenting everything that day, not just, photographs of him, but other things that might be taking place along the edges of that day. I think I shot 1,000 photos throughout that day, ending sometime after midnight.
Yeah. The other aspect of your work in the White House was, of course, photographing the president with guests in the Oval Office, and there were thousands, obviously, of those occasions. But I want to again just focus on a couple. They have to do with children. One is a famous photo of President Obama with a young boy in the office, and the young boy is feeling his hair, and that was a poignant moment in terms of the impact of having a Black American in the Oval Office and a young boy in that moment. And there was also the moment where it was during Halloween, I believe, President Obama outside the Oval Office as he was being shot, if you will, by a young child in Spider-Man outfit. How poignant are those moments in showing the historical aspects of, I guess, that first young boy, and also the fun that can be had within the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those photographs that you mentioned tell you something about him as a human being, right? That first picture where he as a president of the United States would bend over and say, "Go ahead and touch my head," after this kid had said, that his friends had told him his haircut was just like the president's. But that picture had certain, definitely resonated with the African American community and kids of color. And here you've got this 3-year-old African American kid touching the head of the president of the United States that looks like him. So that really resonated, I think, in a profound way. The Spider-Man photo, just as circumstance happens, I actually just talked to that kid the other day, who he's now 14 years old. I think he was 2 or 3 at the time. He has no real remembrance of that. When you're that young, you tend not to remember those things. And so I had never really talked to him afterwards. So, but his dad, who I know, had contacted me, and I did a Zoom with him. His name's Nicholas. I did a Zoom with Nicholas just because he wanted to meet me. Because he's heard so much about that photograph and he's got it hanging in his room and things like that. So that was kind of a fun conversation, just reliving that moment with him, through my eyes for the first time with him, which was kind of special.
Yeah. Absolutely, I can see how that would be. Let me just ask you, with the few more minutes we have left. I saw a video with you and the former President Obama. It was a video about the national parks and all the photos you took of
Yeah.
him at national parks. Are you still in contact with the president? And if so, how often? And how's that working out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually in contact with him on a regular basis because we play Words with Friends online, together. And then I text him occasionally, not that often, and I usually see him at least once. Sometime, I think last year I saw him 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't seen him this year yet. I'll see him in August, and then if I may see him out on the campaign trail as well. I may do some photography this fall, and if he comes nearby, I'll definitely see him then.
Yeah. Let me ask you, of course, you're going to be here at Bristol Community College on the 18th. Again, unfortunately, tickets are sold out. But if people are to attend one of your events, what can they expect to see?
I think every event's a little different. This one is a traditional one where I'll be projecting images on a large screen, telling behind-the-scenes stories. I think the presentation will go for about an hour, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A with the audience. And it will at times be emotional, and I think at times, hopefully, people will find some humor in my presentation.
So as we wrap up, Pete, let me ask you, when you were a kid growing up in South Dartmouth, New Bedford, South Coast, did you ever envision this type of career for you at this stage? Author of many books, just the success you had with your jobs at the White House. Did you ever envision this type of life?
Oh, no way. I think, how when you have your high school yearbook and they have all the, most, best athlete and all this kind of stuff, and there's usually one most likely to succeed. I think actually I would have been, I would have been voted most unlikely to succeed if we go back to high school days.
Yeah. So let me just final question. We're actually recording this interview on Monday, April 8th in the morning. For those of you who know, this is the big eclipse day. I've got to ask you, are you doing anything photography wise for the eclipse on this eclipse
I don't know
day?
if you can see there, but I got my long lens solar filter ready to go.
Yeah.
I'm in Peoria, Illinois, and will not see the full total eclipse. But I'll be out there. I'll be out there, hopefully photographing the eclipse at 97%. I believe it is here.
Yeah. That is still very close and not too bad. Pete Souza, I really appreciate your time. We welcome you. We looking forward to seeing you on April 18th. Thank you for being gracious with your time, and all the best. I wish you all the best.
You bet. I look forward to this. I guess next week, right?
Yeah.
No, is it? Yeah.
Yeah. April 18th next week.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pete.
Okay.